Hey guys. Tonight we're diving into why you wouldn't last 24 hours in medieval times. Forget everything Hollywood told you. No dragons, no dramatic slow-mo sword fights, and definitely no hot knight with flawless skin and a British accent. What you're really in for: parasites, rotting teeth, and a breakfast that may or may not contain yesterday's stew and a hint of rat. Before we dive in, hit like if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, just not something medieval, please, and let's jump in. You wake up on a straw mattress. Correction. A lice-infested, rat-nibbled, straw mattress that smells like the inside of a goat's armpit. You sit up, groggy, and the first thing you notice isn't the cold or the hunger, it's the itch. Everywhere. On your neck, behind your knees, possibly in your soul. There's no glass window letting in the morning sun. Just a tiny wooden shutter, barely holding back a draft that smells like smoke, manure, and something suspiciously dead. You're in a one-room cottage, and I use the word cottage generously. You share it with your family, a term that includes 5 other humans, a pig, 2 chickens, and your cousin Jeff, who hasn't bathed since the plague last came through. You stretch and hit your hand on the ceiling. It's that low, which is great, because now your palm smells like soot and old meat. Welcome to your morning. Still feeling romantic about the good old days. Thinking you'd be some badass sword-swinging noble with a castle and a moat. Yeah, ... No. Statistically speaking, you're probably a peasant, and worse, a healthy one. Which means no resting, no breaks, and no mysterious illnesses to temporarily get you out of chores. You're the backbone of this feudal machine, which is a fancy way of saying, congrats, you work 16 hours a day and still might die of a splinter. You know how people complain when their iPhone updates automatically at 3 a.m. Try hauling water from a well, boiling it over an open flame just to make soup, and then finding out your only spoon has been stolen by a neighbor again. And by the way, you're already late. You were supposed to be up before sunrise. But don't worry, your Lord will remind you, with a stick. But let's say you survived the morning routine. No dysentery yet. Nobody's accused you of witchcraft, and Jeff hasn't coughed blood today. Progress. Now comes breakfast, and work, and church, and mud, and more work. So what does a full medieval day actually look like? What do you eat? What do you wear? And more importantly, what happens when you need to go? Let's just say that chamber pot isn't as empty as it looks. You feel the itch spreading again. You hear the clanging of distant bells, and someone screaming outside. But that's for another part of your very, very long day. All right, you've stumbled out of your flea-ridden bed, managed not to step directly into the chamber pot. Congrats. And now you're wondering, where's the coffee? There isn't any. Coffee doesn't make it to Europe for another 300 years. So instead, you get a bowl of porridge. And not the creamy, honey-drizzled oat milk chia, whatever your barista makes. No, this is more like yesterday's barley water, slightly sour, maybe fermented, maybe not, with a few mysterious grey lumps floating in it. There's a crust of bread on the side, hard enough to file down your molars, and you eat it anyway. Because if you don't, you'll faint by midday. Or worse, Jeff will eat it for you. And Jeff bites show modern cereal versus a mouldy, medieval porridge bowl with steam rising off it in a sad little curl. Time to work. You're assigned to the Lord's fields today, which means you're walking several miles, on foot, barefoot if you're poor enough, across freezing mud to dig up root vegetables you don't get to eat, tools, a wooden hoe, and your aching back breaks only if you collapse. And hydration, a weak ale called small beer, because actual water will probably kill you. Yes, water equals death. Beer equals breakfast. Welcome to the logic of the 1300s. By now, your hands are blistering, your stomach is still complaining about that ghost porridge, and the local priest is yelling at a child for smiling, which, fun fact, is probably a sin. You look up at the sky and hope for rain, not because you like weather, but because that means work stops early. Think your laundry routine is hard. Imagine washing your tunic. You have one, in a freezing stream with lye soap made from ashes and pig fat. Oh, and you're expected to do that after you've spent the whole day farming, walking, and dodging whatever medieval disease Jeff is incubating this week. Modern washing machine versus peasant woman beating fabric on rocks in brown water. By the way, don't talk back to anyone above you. That includes the reeve, the priest, the lord, the bailiff, and possibly the guy who owns the communal donkey. You're at the bottom of the food chain, just above serfs, just below mud. And don't ask questions. Education, reading, you're joking, right? Literacy is for monks and rich men. You're lucky if you can count to 10 without using your fingers and Jeff's toes. By the way, don't talk back to anyone above you. That includes the reeve, the priest, the lord, the bailiff, and possibly the guy who owns the communal donkey. You're at the bottom of the food chain, just above serfs, just below mud. And don't ask questions. Education, reading, you're joking, right? Literacy is for monks and rich men. You're lucky if you can count to 10 without using your fingers and Jeff's toes. The sun's setting now, but you're not done. There's evening prayers, more chores, and maybe, just maybe, a communal meal if you're lucky. But here's the real question. Where do you sleep safely when you live in a village without locks? What happens if someone accuses you of stealing their chicken? And just how dangerous is nighttime in the Middle Ages? You wipe the sweat from your brow. You hear wolves in the distance. Jeff is sleep mumbling something about the shadow with red eyes. And tomorrow is a feast day, which means everyone's watching. But we'll get to that soon enough. So, the sun's down. That glorious medieval sun that did all the work the electric grid does now. And when it leaves, you're left with darkness. Not mood lighting dark, not let's get cozy dark. We're talking can single quotes T-C-own-hand, trip over D-cat. Did someone just whisper, my name dark? Your only light is a sputtering tallow candle, made from animal fat, and it smells exactly how it sounds. You huddle near the hearth, not for aesthetic vibes, but to survive the frostbite nibbling at your toes. Your single outfit, still damp from the morning dew and, let's be honest, your own sweat. Oh, and that thing you heard scurrying behind the firewood. Probably a rat, or something hungry enough to challenge one. Sleep is ambitious. You lie back down on the same straw sack from this morning, now itchier, somehow wetter, and suspiciously warmer in places where it should not be warm. Your housemates, already snoring, except Jeff, who is talking in his sleep again, something about the forest spirits stealing his breath. Normal, totally normal. Medieval sleep isn't like modern sleep. They practiced what's called segmented sleep. You sleep for a few hours, wake up in the middle of the night, think about your sins, maybe pray, maybe panic, then go back to sleep again. So now it's 2 a.m., you're wide awake, the fire's dying, and outside, you hear hoofbeats, not just passing by, circling, feeling anxious. Good, That's your 1300 survival instinct kicking in. But don't tell anyone. Mental health doesn't exist yet. Sadness, demonic possession, anxiety, sin, hallucinations. You've got about 6 hours before someone accuses you of witchcraft. Talk to your friends. What friends? They think reading is suspicious, and you once told them a dream that didn't involve crops. You're on thin ice, my guy. Also, God is watching. Always. Not just in a I believe in something higher way, but in a literal, the church owns your land, your time, and probably your guilt way. Miss Mass. Pay a fine. Talk during Mass. Penance. Sleep through Mass. Honestly, that might be your only rest this week. And whatever you do, don't ask why the priest has wine and you have fermented goat milk. That's heresy, and you don't want to know what they do to heretics. The wind howls. Your candle goes out. Someone or something is knocking on the door. You pull the blanket up over your head. It doesn't help. It smells like feet. Outside, a bell rings once, then twice, which means only one thing. Someone's dead. Or worse, ... Someone's missing, and you're still expected to show up for fieldwork in 4 hours. But what happens when someone blames you for the disappearance? What if they find your muddy footprints near the woods? And what if Jeff starts telling everyone about the dream he had? The one where you were a wolf. Let's just say, tomorrow might be your last 24 hours. But that's a tale for another night. And the fire's almost out. Morning again. You survived the night, sort of. You're groggy, shivering, and your back feels like it lost a fist fight with a donkey cart. You stumble outside to fetch water, again, and that's when you notice it. Not peaceful silence. Suspicious silence. Villagers huddled in 2s and 3s, whispering in the corners, glancing your way. You catch a word, witchcraft, then another, tracks. Jeff's standing by the well. He won't look at you. His eyes are puffy. He's either been crying or possessed again. You know how Jeff is. And then, the reeve arrives. The local enforcer of the Lord's will, armed with a stick, a sneer, and enough unchecked authority to ruin your entire bloodline. Congratulations, you're now officially suspicious. Why? Because you went outside at night, because someone saw a shadow, because you talked too little or too much, because your cow died last week, because your eyebrows are shaped weird. Yes, that was a real thing. And now you're hauled in front of the village elders for questioning. No lawyer, no evidence, just a vibe. And if the vibe is bad, so is your future. Let's play a fun medieval game called Guilty Either Way. Here's how it works. You get dunked in a freezing river. If you float, you're a witch. Burn them. If you sink, innocent, but also dead. You get pricked with needles. If they find a devil's mark, birthmark, mole, freckle, weird skin patch, guilty. You cry during questioning. Guilty, you don't cry. Sociopath, still guilty. Honestly, your best bet is to throw yourself at the mercy of the priest. But remember, he's also Jeff's uncle. And Jeff talks. Imagine being cancelled in 2025 because someone said you gave off weird vibes in a group chat. Now imagine that, but with firewood and torches. Because here, once the rumor starts, it spreads like plague. Actually, faster than plague. Because most people can't read, so gossip is basically the internet. Your fate, in the hands of villagers who think sneezing is spiritual warfare. So what now? Do you run? Where, the next village over already thinks you have devil eyes. Do you confess? To what? To letting Jeff borrow your spoon. Because somehow, that might actually be heresy. But wait, here comes the bailiff. He's holding rope, and behind him, a cart full of kindling. You feel the cold set in, deeper than before. Not weather, something else. Something final. But maybe, just maybe, there's still a way out. If you can survive one more day, one more secret, one more accusation, let's hope the firewood's still wet. So, there you are, standing in the village square, hands bound with coarse rope, ankles wobbling on splintered wood, your knees buckling, your breath visible, the crowd loving this. Jeff's crying again, might be guilt, might be fleas. Hard to tell with Jeff. The Reeve steps forward and reads something off a ragged piece of parchment. It's not your name, it's not even your crime. It's just Latin. You have no idea what it means. Neither does he. But it sounds official. And in the Middle Ages, that's all it takes. You're given 3 choices. 1. Confess and be exiled. Translation: starve in a ditch within the week. 2. Refuse and face God's judgment. Hint: you've already been tied up. God's verdict seems pre-decided. 3. Rat someone else out. The Jeff option. But here's the kicker: you're innocent. Unless being confused, cold, and slightly sarcastic counts as a sin, which, in medieval Europe, kind of does. You look around the crowd. Most are your neighbors. Some have borrowed your tools. One once asked you to help deliver their goat's twins. Now they're all waiting to see if you'll burst into flame. Imagine every group chat you've ever been in could vote on whether or not you should be set on fire. Now remove the chat, remove the phone, add pitchforks, and no undo button. That's medieval justice, fast, brutal, and blessed by a guy who hasn't bathed since last Easter. But just as the fire is being lit, a scream breaks the tension. Not yours, someone else's. A real emergency. The blacksmith's son has fallen into the well. Suddenly, everyone bolts. Even the Reeve, even Jeff. And there you are, tied to a post. Alone, flames just starting to hiss. This is your chance. No one's watching. The rope is loose, and you remember the priest's words. God helps those who help themselves, or at least those who run fast. So you bolt into the woods, barefoot, freezing, chased by fear and wolves and the distant smell of something still burning. But the forest isn't empty, not at night, not now. You hear breathing that isn't yours. Branches snap, a distant chant, or just the wind playing tricks. You're out of the village, sure, but you're not safe. Not yet, not from the creatures, not from the hunger, not from what lives between the trees, and most definitely, not from Jeff. Somewhere in the dark, a bell rings again, just once, this time. A warning, a reckoning. But how long can you run before morning finds you again? And what kind of dawn will it be, if you survive the night? So, here you are, covered in dirt, probably lice, possibly divine suspicion. You've escaped execution. You've outrun rumors. And technically, you survived 24 hours. But at what cost? Your dignity, your health, your ability to trust a man named Jeff ever again. Let's be honest, modern life might be chaotic, sure. But at least you can microwave a burrito without divine permission. And your neighbor probably isn't plotting to drown you over a weird dream. So the next time someone romanticizes the good old days, just smile, nod, and maybe send them this video. If you made it this far, you're a survivor, kind of. Emotionally, at least. Smash that like button if Jeff gave you anxiety. Hit subscribe if you'd last longer than 24 hours. And drop a comment below. What era should we throw you into next? Would you prefer a plague-ridden Victorian street, a lawless Wild West saloon, or a Roman bathhouse with very questionable hygiene standards? Let me know. Thanks for watching. Stay historically humble. And remember, being born in the 21st century, possibly the greatest survival hack of all.